Welcome to the channel, everyone. In this video, I want to talk about removing spot welds. If you're doing any kind of structural repair work, you've got to replace some panels. If you're doing restoration work, you're going to be running into welds you have to remove. And there's a lot of options out there. You can grind them, you can cut them, you can drill them. I'm going to show how most of these tools work, some of the pros and cons with them. And the main thing you have to think about when you're removing spot welds is not so much how this panel is going to come off the car, but how are you putting it back? Is the top panel that you're removing, is that going to be saved, or is it going to be scrapped and replaced? You have to think about these things ahead of time so you don't cause any issues farther down in the repair process. So let's get started. I'm going to show some of these tools and how they work. Okay, the first tool I want to show is this grinder with the 3/16 cutoff wheel in it. Now this I probably used for years. 90% of all the spot welds were taken out with this. And then the belt sander come along, and that was kind of a game changer. And I did a previous video on these two tools comparison, so I'm not going to talk about those too much, but that's the options for grinding the welds. And next we got a high-speed die grinder with carbide bits. This really doesn't grind the welds, it cuts them. And there's all different size tips you can get here, different sizes, different configurations. With the die grinder, you want to use a tip that's rounded on the end. These work pretty good, but limited use. Kind of only use these when nothing else will fit or nothing will work what you're trying to do, but it is an option. Okay, as far as drilling welds, next up is just a set of high-speed drill bits, and I think that's a 5/16 in there. These work real good, but the issue is we're getting more and more high-strength steel or ultra-high-strength steel and boron, and usually these aren't going to cut it. So they've got bits that are specially made for ultra high strength steel and boron, and I've never had much luck with these. I don't know how you go about sharpening some of these things. If you can see there, it's got a weird end on it. I've got a few of these laying around, and every time I've used them, you maybe drill 2 welds and they're already dull. And like I said, they're about impossible to sharpen, and they make these things so hard they usually don't just get dull. The edges will actually chip off, and then they're pretty much useless. These things are very expensive too. I've just never had much luck using them. You always try and have to go back to a grinder, but you run into a problem if you're trying to remove a weld and you can't use the grinder because you're going to be saving that top panel. Okay, then we've got these sheet metal hole cutters, and these are basically like a hole saw, and it comes with an assortment of replaceable tips on there. They're not that expensive to buy. When they get dull, you can't really sharpen them. These will work pretty good. I don't use them all that much. You need to run these at a slow speed, use cutting oil on them. There is issues using these and removing spot welds, and I'm going to talk about that shortly. I'll show how they cut. Okay, and once your spot welds are either drilled or ground out, you're going to have to separate the 2 panels, and you can use an air hammer, a couple different types of chisel ends, and this one here is actually called a spot weld cutter, and I use this probably 90% of the time. It's got a little bit of a concave to the end. It's beveled on both sides, and this here is just a straight chisel. A little bit thicker. This will slide in without damaging the panels as much. Or I think this is made by Stick, and this is needs to be sharpened up, but you can cut them on the end here like a regular chisel, or slide it in this way and hammer on the back side. And you can tell that used to be straight across there, so it's got a lot of use, and it's nice and thin. And if you use your tools, the drills, the grinders, whatever you're going to do to remove the spot welds, if you do it correctly, you shouldn't have to do a whole lot of chiseling. Let's get started, and I'm going to show you how this spot weld cutter works here. All right, on these hole cutters here, the tip on this thing is a little center guide, and it's spring loaded. So it comes with a center punch, and you punch it, and that'll go in there, and that'll hold that bit steady. But these things always have a little bit of slop in them, and you have trouble with this thing wanting to walk. You'll start drilling, it'll slide off. So I usually just take and dimple it with an 1/8" drill bit. And I found you don't want to go all the way through, because that's about the size of this, and it'll just slide down in there, and if you twist a little bit, you can snap it off. So I'll just put a little divot in there with the drill and then drill it. I'm going to put a little cutting oil on there. let's see if we went through enough. Okay, now here's the issue I was talking about. Being it's a hole saw, it doesn't drill the center out. So if you've got a row of spot welds you're trying to remove, you go to put your chisel in there, and now the end of the chisel is going to run into this and you can't get all the way through there. If it can be chiseled from multiple sides, if there's still a little bit holding it together, it'll help, but the chisel is sliding in and it hits that center, this left. So that's about the only issue with it. Once we get it popped apart, you can see how it's separated the weld, but that's what you run into. Other than that, they do a pretty good job. They're a little bit slow, so I don't use them all that much. Okay, I know what you're thinking. Why not just drill all the way through this? You don't have that center nugget to worry about. Well, usually when you're using these hole saws like this, you just want to drill the top layer without going through the bottom. For instance, putting a floor pan in the rear of a car, you don't want to drill all the way through the frame rail, or maybe an apron on a car, same thing. So that's usually what they're used for, and they do give you a pretty flat bottom once you got this top piece removed and ground off. You won't usually over drill through your lower piece. Okay, and as I said before, first thing I want to do is identify the welds that I want to grind and the welds I want to drill. For instance, if it's taken off this quarter panel here and going to leave this lower piece, I can just grind these spot welds. So usually what I'll do, I'll take a Sharpie, a watercolor marker, I'll come through ahead of time and I'll just mark them. They're a lot easier to see once you start grinding on them. I'm going to show you my tricks on removing these welds with a drill. What I'm going to do, I'm going to drill these welds out like I'm going to save this rear extension piece here. So I want to do very little damage to this, and I'm not too concerned about the piece underneath. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do here is drill pilot holes in here with an 1/8 inch bit, and then I'm going to move up to a bigger size to finish these. You don't want to undersize the drill bit in here because you'll end up tearing little excess metal out of here if the hole isn't big enough, but you can't go too big. But I'm going to drill a few undersize and show you what I'm talking about. Okay, these last three, I'm going to go just a little oversized. Okay, I'm going to take the air chisel, get this thing taken apart. It actually didn't tear any extra metal out of here. It come apart pretty good, but you can see how distorted this is from these first three welds compared to the last three. These just kind of came apart. They recommend a 5/16 punch or 5/16 drill, but usually what happens, a lot of times when these panels are spot welded together at the factory, the tips from the resistant welder aren't lined up, and you might have the back side of the weld is just a little bit off from the front side, so going just a little bit oversized, you can hopefully catch most of the weld. You're not really going too much over. I think a 5/16, I'll use an 11/32 bit. Okay, if you've been working in a body shop long enough, you've probably had to put a used quarter or two on, and I've done enough of them in my career. One of the hardest things about a used quarter is separating this off the wheelhouse. You know, if this is the used quarter panel you have to put back on the car, you're not going to grind these welds because you're just going to destroy this whole lip. And I don't really like drilling them out because I may want to glue this on and I don't want a bunch of holes in there. So I'm going to show you my trick how I do it. Okay, when you're removing the quarter panel from the quarter section of the car, I just come in, cut the wheelhouse somewhere just so I can remove it, and then I deal with it on the sawhorses. I clean off the paint, E-coat and everything so I can see my welds. I use my grinder with the 3/16 cutoff wheel in there, and you can come in here and you can grind these welds on the back side, and you can watch your progress by looking at the metal. It'll start changing a blue color, but you can see if you're on the weld or if you're missing it. And then that's where this tool comes in handy. You can just slide that in there and split it. So I'm going to do a few of these welds and see how it comes out. Okay, you should be able to see how these welds will turn a light shade of blue from grinding on them. They'll darken up a little bit, and that's from the heat from the grinding wheel on the back side. So I'm going to take my seam buster now and separate these two panels. All right, that seemed to work pretty good. Now, once you remove the rest of this wheelhouse, get it out of your way, you can come back in here and just clean up the back side of here, get it ready to glue, spot weld, whatever you're gonna do. But it leaves you with a nice edge on here. You don't have excess holes in there you have to MIG weld up. You're not grinding through it, so that's the way I like doing it. Okay, I think that's about enough information on removing welds. Assess your panel, what you're going to remove and what you're going to save. That's going to dictate which tools you're going to use. You don't want to start grinding and cutting and chiseling and then figure out later when you go to put a new part on it, you kind of destroyed something that you need. And usually I'd go around ahead of time, like I marked those spot welds, and I'd make notes on there where I can grind this, cut this, save this. It'll help you out in the end. And then when you're removing your welds, make sure you take your time, but try and get as much weld as you can removed. The less chiseling and prying you can do, the better off you're going to be. You'll have just less damage to clean up at the end. You'll get a better fit and finish out of it. So anyway, that'll wrap this video up. You know the rest. Thanks for watching.